Today is August 22nd, 2011. My name is Joe Bruckner. I'm a volunteer at the Atlanta History Center, and we are at the Atlanta History Center in Atlanta, Georgia. With me today is Ed Woods and Tony Hilliard, who are both volunteers at the History Center, and we're honored to have Judge T. Jackson Bedford from Atlanta, Georgia with us. Judge Bedford is a Vietnam veteran, served his country, and he's here to talk about his experiences in Vietnam and his experiences in life. This is part of the Library of Congress Veterans History Project, and Judge Bedford, we really appreciate you coming in here to talk with us today. Could you give us your full name and current address, please?
Right. Well, my name is Thomas Jackson Bedford, Jr., and I live at 3230 Weston Place, Atlanta, Georgia, 30327.
And where and when were you born?
I was born in Opelika, Alabama, in April 18th, 1944, right towards the end of the war.
Okay. And tell us a little bit about your upbringing.
Well, I was born in Opelika. My father was at war. He was in the Navy during World War II, first in submarines and then in amphibious. And my mother lived with my grandmother there in Opelika and Auburn, where they went to school. And so my first memories, I vaguely remember some about that period of time. I think it wasn't until 1945 or so that my father saw me. I think I was like 18 months old before he saw me, maybe 2 years old. And then he got out of the Navy and became an instructor for the Agriculture Department in Alabama, and we lived in Dothan for a short period of time. And then the Korean War was ramping up. He went back in to active duty for the Korean War, and I think that was like 1948. We lived in Nebraska. I'm a Navy brat, obviously, from this. And then lived in Nebraska, then we moved all around. I've lived on the East Coast all of my life because that's where his ships were out of. During the Korean War, his ship came into Long Beach, and I spent over a summer and maybe a few months more than that at Long Beach back in like 1951 or 52. I'm, kind of hazy about some of that. Ultimately, he was stationed in Oklahoma, believe it or not. We called him ComNav, Oklahoma. And he was the commanding officer of all the Naval Reserve training centers in Oklahoma, North Texas, and South Kansas, kind of those areas. So I ended up growing up for my junior and senior high years in Oklahoma City. And so I consider myself, an Oklahoman in that regard. And after I went through high school in Oklahoma, graduated, I went to the University of Virginia. And there I got a degree in international relations, thinking that I was going to go into the Foreign Service. But part of what you're probably going to ask me, and it'll come out, I went to the University of Virginia on a Navy scholarship. I took competitive examinations. I got a full scholarship to whatever school would accept me that had an NROTC unit. So since my father was a career naval officer, I thought that that was potentially what I would want to do. And also, going to the University of Virginia, I thought if I don't make a career out of the Navy, I might come back and be a career Foreign Service officer. So that's what my degree was in from the University of Virginia. That takes me up to 1966 in a thumbnail.
Okay. Well, tell us what happened in 1966.
Well, in 1966, I graduated from the University of Virginia, and I got my commission. And since I'd been a MIDI, and may as well fill in a little bit here, during the summers I'd had to go on midshipman cruises, just like we were treated like the academy. And so I did aboard the USS DuPont. I think it was DD 942, 945, I can't remember. Spent a summer on that as a MIDI. And then my second year I went on what we call the Marine training and the Aviation training. And so I went down a little creek and I jumped out of helicopters and climbed down the sides of ships and did the Marine thing, and then went down to Corpus Christi, Texas, and flew and got exposed to naval aviation. So I had an interest then in naval aviation. I'd been around model airplanes all my life. In my senior year, I was on the USSS Leahy, the DLG-16, which was a guided missile frigate. So then I came up and graduated, and I had been encouraged by some of my instructors to go into aviation. I was originally not planning to do it because I had to have glasses, you know, to correct my vision, and the Navy's very, very strict. And they told me of this new program called the Naval Aviation Officer, now Naval Flight Officer program. And so I opted and made application to that program and was accepted. So after I graduated from Virginia in the spring of 1966, I immediately reported to Pensacola, where I began my basic naval aviation training, where pilots and NFOs were all trained together for the first initial phase of aviation training.
Talk a little bit about your training, where you went for various training, what you were being trained to do, any experiences that stand out in your memory?
Well, at Pensacola, after we got through basic aviation training, the basic school, flight training, then they designated us as flight officers, and we had to go over to the basic flight officer school, which at that time, I think I forget the acronym, we call it Banana School, BNAO, Basic Naval Aviation Officer Training. And that was over there I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the field, but it's where the Blue Angels are. So we were right next door to the Blue Angels. The field's still there, the Blue Angels still operate out of there. We had a hangar over there, and we trained over there. And once we got through with that, then we went down to advanced, wherever we were going to go and what kind of flight officers we were going to be. We went to various areas for the advanced training. The thing that sticks in my mind about Pensacola, other than I was told I'd find my wife in Pensacola, which I always thought, you know, they say this, and all naval, you know, aviators end up marrying somebody from that area, but I actually found her in Mobile. Excuse me. So, but we used to fly in some interesting conglomerations of planes down there, and one of them we fly in, we call it the Banana Bomber, and it was a little twin-engine Beechcraft, which with the split tail and all of that, and had no insulation whatsoever in it, and it rattled and, you know, clanged and all that. I mean, we did our navigation exercises in that particular plane, and then we got some jet experience and all, which was really kind of neat and a lot of fun. Then I ended up, after graduating from that, I went to Glen Cove, to the Naval Air Station in Glen Cove for basic, rather advanced training. And down there, they then started training us in the area that we were going into, and I had been designated, for some reason, an electronic warfare officer. Now my recollection is coming back. I had actually wanted to go into P3s and be a TACO, which would be looking for submarines, doing anti-submarine work. But there was an explosion on one of the carriers, and I'm thinking it was the Forrestal. Tremendous, and it killed a number of NFOs and pilots. There was, you know, and it was serious. They changed my pipeline, so to speak, and they came back and designated me to go into electronic warfare, EWO. So then I went down, when I went down to NAIS Glen Cove, that's what I trained in. And so we flew in the Saberliner down there, which was used for the Rio training that rode in the back seat of the F-4s. Most of the NFO advanced training was all done down at Glen Cove at that time. I got my wings in March of 1967 and got married in March of 1967. And my first duty station I reported to was at Quonset Point, Rhode Island, NAS Quonset Point. And I reported to, at that time its designation was VAW 33. It soon was changed to VAQ 33 because that is the designator for electronic warfare. We were just at the beginning of electronic warfare. on the beginning edge. So the VAW stood for early warning, but we were really not an early warning squadron. We were an tactical electronic warfare squadron. And we were flying the what we call the Fat Spads. And they were the Sky Raiders that had been reconfigured for 4 seats. So we had 2 side by side in the front with a pilot and the NFO, and we had 2 air crew in the back. And I was trying to find a picture of the plane to bring, and the best that I could do was one with me climbing aboard, and on this picture the wings are folded, and you can see me climbing in on the right side where I sat, and you can see the hatch in the back where the air crew sat. Okay, the hatch is in the back, and you see me climbing aboard, and of course I'm doing the pose for the picture routine. Nonetheless, then I had to, in those days, the squadron was like a RAG, which was a replacement air group. Nowadays, in a lot of the squadrons, you go to what's called a replacement air group, and for some of the fighters, squadrons, that's what they did, where they trained to come up to speed on the plane. But for NFOs, they sent us right straight to the squadron. So we had to spend, the first couple of months, in this plane, getting accustomed to the plane, what our responsibilities were, training, and doing all those kinds of things. And we shared a hangar, this is interesting, with VX-6, which was the Antarctica squadron flying the big Hercules C-130s. So when they were not in Christchurch, they were turning up outside my office all the time. And it's loud enough with ADs turning up, and you put a big, C-130 turning up out there, you got some noise. And of course those hangars were World War II hangars, or pre-World War II hangars. So they were cold, drafty, the usual, and noisy. Yeah.
Now, you say you were being trained in electronic warfare. What exactly were you being trained to do specifically?
Well, I was being trained for tactical electronic warfare as opposed to information gathering warfare. And so our planes went in with the strikes. And for current generation, I don't know how many years in the future somebody's going to be watching this, but right now there's a plane the Navy has called the Prowler. And the Prowler is a national asset. It's an extraordinarily powerful airplane because it can close down electronic circuits and all this kind of thing. I don't even know what it can do. But the Prowler was not in existence at the time. And so we and some of the Air Force versions of not the straight A, but some other types of versions, what we were doing is we were carrying jamming equipment and chaff and other equipment used to confuse enemy radars or to force them to go, in our case, especially when I went to Vietnam, was to force them to go to either barrage or to a manual acquisition. And so we were trained to do that and to jam the radars for the strikes.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's it in a nutshell.
Okay.
Okay.
So where did you go after Rhode Island?
Well, I was in Rhode Island at Quonset Point, where I deployed from. See, and this was the squadron that I was with when I deployed, so there's where the story, the Vietnam story begins. And I would like to share this because I think this is a personal thing that people might be interested in, is when I first reported to the squadron, I was brand new. I have been in commission for approximately a year, ensign. I just married, and I go up and report to the squadron, and they start telling me things. And by the way, I went to the Naval Justice School to become the legal officer for the squadron, which was my collateral billet. But they came to me, and I don't even remember the month, but they maybe came to me in like June or July and said, "We're going to send you to Vietnam." Well, I had just been married, and I felt that it was very important that at least my marriage get off to some sort of a decent footing. And I asked my commanding officer, which all of us sitting here know sometimes this is heresy to make a request like this because people challenge and question you. And I said, I don't have any problem with going to Vietnam. I mean, I fully expect to do my duty for my country, and that's what I trained for and why I'm in the Navy. But I said I would appreciate it if I didn't go on the next detachment, and if you could delay my, deployment. And I had an excellent commanding officer, A.B. Wilson was his name. And Commander Wilson, he said, yeah, we don't really need you. We've got other folks. And so he delayed it. And it didn't end up on my fitness, record anywhere. And I was very appreciative. And so I deployed in the following early spring of 1967. Meanwhile, we did training exercises and flying out over the North Atlantic. And we wore back then, we had to wear what was called an anti-exposure suit. Because the weather was so cold, we basically were in anti-exposure suits from like the 1st of September until right around May, June sometime up there, because we're in the North Atlantic off of Rhode Island. And we called them poopy suits, because they got kind of poopy, with stuff, with sweating in them and all that. And they were very uncomfortable, and I always said, if the plane goes in and I die, it's because of this dadgum suit, because I'm not going to be able to get out of the plane. And they were rubberized, and they were like a space suit, and they had this huge zipper that went here and cuffs, and we had an air hose that went in on our side where we plugged into the ventilating system in the plane, and it would run air through there, and of course we'd blow up. They looked like a diver suit is what it looked like. So I always worried about that, but I think it's kind of interesting because we wore those things. So in a way, I was kind of excited to be going to warm weather, But to get ready for deployment, we first, and these dates are kind of hard, you guys know how this works. But we started working on it probably in December of 1967, yes, because I deployed in 68, I may have misspoken. In 67, and we were designated to go aboard the Intrepid, and I think the first part of January in 1968, we reported to the Intrepid, and we went down to Puerto Rico at Rosie Roads to start doing training with the ship and becoming part of the ship's company. And we would fly the planes down, and we would take the air crew and all of our equipment on a twin-engine Fairchild of some sort of, It was one of the planes the admirals like to fly around in. And I was actually the air crew equipment officer at the time, so I didn't fly down. I flew down in the big plane with all the air crew, which was a trip in itself, because you guys know if you've got a bunch of sailors or soldiers to deal with, and most of them are young and crazy. And I remember going into Nassau for a fuel stop, and I told them, you be back here at the plane at a certain time, and I swear I thought I was going to have to get the Nassau police to go out looking for them, because they just went everywhere. And here I was, still an ensign, and I'm trying to keep these guys herded and corralled, and I'm thinking, what's going to happen to me if I, fly into Rosie Roads and I've lost half the, the air crew and the plane handlers, that type of thing. But so we did training down there, and I think that's called Operation Springboard, and I think we went down several times. My memory's a little hazy on this, but we were, getting acclimated to the ship and the pilots and the NFOs. We were doing carrier landings and all of that, which was one of my first carrier landings was aboard the America. I forget, we went out for some reason, and it was the first time I'd gone aboard, and that's a super carrier at the time, and it was a nice deck to be landing on compared to the Intrepid, so that was kind of neat. And I'm trying to think, there was something I wanted to share about that particular experience. Oh, in the meantime, in February of 1968, we had to go through survival, escape, and evasion training. And they sent us up to the North Maine woods to do this. We flew into Portland, Maine, the snow was 20 feet high around the runway. And we said, let us get this straight. We're going to Vietnam. Isn't there a jungle there or something like that? And why are we in the Maine woods, for this training? But this was a pretty intense experience. And they put us out in the woods and told us here what we had to do. And we had to spend a couple of days evading and surviving in about 10 feet of snow. And then avoid being captured. And they gave us for food a rabbit. Each group got a rabbit. We were in about groups of, I can't remember, like 4 to 10 or something, I forget what it was. But nobody else, everybody was squeamish. Well, I grew up in Oklahoma and shot rabbits and squirrels and everything else, and I in meadowlark, and I've eaten, everything I shot, and all this stuff. So I volunteered and I killed the rabbit, cleaned the rabbit, did all this kind of stuff for them. So it kind of started out that way. And it was, they put us on snowshoes. That was also, we thought, well, we're going to the jungle, this makes sense. This is typical, you know how it is. This is typical government, the Army and the Navy always do it. But we got captured. It was so bad that every time we'd take a step, we'd drop 10 feet. The snow would collapse and we'd go down 10 feet and we'd have to build a ramp up and then you'd step because the snow was melting during the day and freezing at night, and one of those things. So finally they tell us, don't ever get on a trail. You've heard that, stay off the trails, there's an ambush on the trail. Well, we said to heck with that, we're getting on the trail. As soon as we got on the trail, up pops the bad guys with their guns, and we're captured. So they put us into a prisoner of war camp, and it was very realistic. And it played this Oriental music, and they were dressed in the uniforms, and they spoke with accents. And I don't want to spend a lot of time going through that, but it was a pretty brutal experience. And then we have, always there's some meathead back at the squadron. And so they decide on a clear day they're going to fly up and strafe the camp, because they've gone looking for the camp. So they come up, and out of the sky comes this AD, and it comes down and makes a couple of gun runs on the camp. And then, of course, that got the guards all mad, and so then we got punished for that. And so then we want to kill the guys that did that stunt with us, because they made life miserable and gave them an excuse to beat up on us more. You know how that works. And we had a bunch of SEALs. And the SEALs we never saw, because the SEALs, they would put them in and then we'd turn around and the SEALs were gone. Now this thing was covered with barbed wire and wire, and it was freezing and all this stuff, and I cannot ever understand how those guys got out. But they were constantly getting out. I mean, it was like, digging under the fence stuff and all that. I do remember I got punished because I knew what was going on, and I tried to lead them in and tried to get them not to belittle themselves, and so they ended up stripping me down and dragging me through the dirt, through the gate, because I wouldn't crawl. They threw me into a coffin on top of rocks, and it went down to like 24, 25 that night. And I was probably hypothermic. All I remember is I shook so bad that I was hitting the top of the coffin because they put it on me. But that's part of what you go through. Yeah. And so, long story short, we went through all that training where they make you make a statement like they did in Hanoi with some of our prisoner of war people that we would see on television, and ask you questions, and they show you later what it came out like. Yeah. So after we did this prisoner of war training, we then deployed in the early spring, I don't remember the date, of 1968 aboard the Intrepid, and did a world transit. And after training down at Roosevelt Roads, and I'm not going to tell you some of the stories there, those are stories I don't want to tell, but we then deployed and secured the plane. Well, I think we flew some of the planes, we call them the CODs, which were the carrier on board delivery planes to pick up mail and stuff like that. But we went to Rio de Janeiro, where we spent some time, and then we went around the Cape of Good Hope, around Africa, across the South Atlantic Ocean. We did not stop in Cape Town because of apartheid. And so the United States policy at that time was anti-apartheid. So they would not, we had thought we were going to stop in South Africa, and everybody was looking forward to it, but we didn't. So we went on around through the Indian Ocean and finally ended up in the Philippines. And we were at Subic Bay, QB Point, which everybody knows about. Is where our port was over there. And got in, and after getting the ship straightened back out again, and we took the planes off and started doing some flying around the Philippines, you know, to kind of get accustomed. We then deployed. And we went into the Gulf of Tonkin, and we were on what's called Yankee Station, which we were assigned with 2 other carriers up north in the Gulf of Tonkin, right off the coast of North Vietnam. And then that's where the strikes, and so we would fly strikes. And we would be about 30, 40 days online, and then maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks offline. I can't remember the cycle, but we would rotate. We also rotated with the other ships. We would fly round the clock. And then we would have some off days when the other ships were flying. And so with 3 ships, we were able to cover. We were pretty much running strikes against south of Haiphong. I forget the name of the area, but it's down south of Haiphong. And we were running interdiction strikes back there. And our plane, our carrier was a small carrier. It was a World War II carrier designated as a CBS. Intrepid was 11. Great, wonderful ship and wonderful skipper and everything. But we were using the A4s to do the attacks. And my plane was what's called an EA-1F, and our nickname for it was the Fat Spat, big single engine prop. And what would happen is we would take off first, and then they would send the jets out, because the jets, you know, only have a loiter time of maybe 2.5 hours at most. So we could stay airborne with a drop tank for 6 hours. So we would take off first, and then after we were on station, and we would, our station would be 1,000 yards, 3,000 yards off the beach, I forget. We weren't supposed to cross the beach, but stay a certain distance off. And we would set up a racetrack pattern and with 2 planes, so we were covering constantly, and we would start jamming on the frequencies that their fire control radars were on. So that's it, kind of the way it worked. Yeah. We had aircrew in the back, and they would look for the radio frequency where these anti-aircraft radars were, you know, trained. And so they would then, we would set up the jammers and jam. And my responsibility was the navigation and the instruction to the guys. I was the weapons officer, so those guys answered to me back there. And they would tell me what was going on. And they had the ability to pipe to me what the sounds were, the pulse rate, pulse repetition frequency, and all of that. And I could hear, and I got so good I could tell you what kind of radar it was just by the sound signature of it. So that's what we did. And flying around the clock, and the strikes would come in, and we would usually cover 2 strikes. So most of our flights, missions were like 4.5 hours, 5 hours, because we would let the jets recover, and then we would go down and land. And we had with us aboard, other than the A4s, and their nickname was a scooter, we called them scooters, we had an F8 detachment. Now there's a difference between a squadron and a detachment. The jets were a squadron. That meant, in fact, I think the air wing had several squadrons in it. And the detachments, like our squadron, would break off a group of planes and send it. So we had 5 of our planes. Our squadron complement was around 25 to 30 planes. But we had detachments in the Mediterranean, we had a detachment in the Far East, which I was on at that time. So we had 5 planes called a detachment, called it DET 11, DET 11, Detachment 11. So we shared a ready room with the F8. So here is, we got this, at the time, the slickest plane, that was the last of the gunfighters, is what they called themselves. They were single seat, and they had the guns, and anybody that knows history about naval or aviation warfare is the guns versus the missiles. And they had the guns where the F-4s, which was the interceptor at the time, basically had missiles until they figured out they needed to put guns back on them. And they had also carried the Sidewinder. So they did photo recon, and then they had what they call Combat Air Patrol wing group of them. There were like, I forget, 3 or 4 planes that they had that did that. They were fighters, and they were out there looking for MiGs. And they would escort the photo recon guys, and they would also be available when we were all in the air. They would be airborne along with A-4s and Air Force planes. And I mean, man, we had planes all over the place. And one of the really exciting things was, of course, we knew these guys. We shared the ready room with them. They were our friends and all. And there would be a MiG fight. And we had several of those that occurred while we were airborne. And of course, we're monitoring guard, and we pick up, and we know the voices, and we know who they are. And it was pretty, you get your adrenaline going. And we would hear them start screaming, you know, I see, there's a MiG, he's behind you. And now I'm rolling in on him, you know. And then, you know, a missile, you know, my missile misfired. I mean, I heard that they were using Sidewinders. And he's coming on you. Then, you know, they would go on, and it'd get real exciting. Of course, we knew these guys, and we were worried about them, but it was also kind of wild listening to them fight. And then they would scream, you know, I got him, and do you see a shoot? I see a shoot. Okay, and, you know, that type of thing. So we had a fellow aboard, his name is Tony Nargi. In fact, his picture's in one of these newsletters that I brought. It's, you know, he was super hot dog, and he's right here, and he was a MiG killer, you know, and he's pictured here getting out of his airplane. And he was credited, and I read a book on the F-8 and all, and he was credited with 1.5 MiG kills while we were over there, which is pretty significant. You guys know that. And I think some of the other guys were in on one of the other kills. You know, it's just like if anybody's ever seen the movie Top Gun, they did this. The F-8s would come back across the deck, and they would roll and go inverted and, you know, come tearing down the deck and do a low pass and all this kind of stuff, you know, when they were out after they'd come back from a fight, you know, type of thing. So that was all pretty exciting. And that was what we did day in and day out. And, you know, we would like have maybe 8 hours off, and we'd do our regular work. It's the regular thing. And then we'd roll a cycle on our flights. Our flights, as I said, would be 4 hours. So I might fly at 6 o'clock at night, and then I might not fly again until 8 o'clock the next morning. And then, you know, there was a spread in there where we overlap. I mean, when I say overlapped, we had another plane flying, and then I might go up again. So when we were online, and I forget how many days we would do this, but we would do this just round the clock. So I'd fly early in the morning, afternoon, late at night, then that cycle would kind of turn, you know, that kind of thing. And I'm trying to remember stories, because you guys want stories and all. I thought one of the neatest things was, it was always kind of neat to go out on the flight deck early in the morning, like at 6 o'clock, and we'd go out to our planes, and they put us back at the back for some reason, and then moved us forward when we started up. But we'd go back there and pre-flight the planes, and it'd be kind of cool in the morning, you know, like 78 or 80 degrees. And you know how mornings are, it's just beautiful at sea. It can really be beautiful if not a storm. And we would get in the planes and pre-flight them and get everything ready. And then they would come across the loudspeaker on the carrier deck. Excuse me. And the deck boss would come across, and he'd say something like, "Good morning, gentlemen." He'd say, "The flight deck temperature is 80 degrees. The wind is from the east-northeast at 15 knots. The carrier is heading into the wind, you may start your engines. That always seemed to be neat to me, you know, I like that. And so all the jets and the props, we'd start turning up and turning up and turning up, you know, and then taxi out and take off. And the cat shots were kind of neat because a lot of times we were on the left cat, and we were on the left cat, I'm the one that gave the signal for the shot. And so they would, you know, hook us up and everything. And after the cod went off and the helicopters went off because they were doing guard for us, you know, if we went in or something, then we would get up there and they would give the signal and, you know, to turn up, and we would turn up and all of that, and then he would look at me and then I'd, you know, give him the salute, and boom, down the deck we'd go. We'd go from 0 to 105 and just lickety-split time, and get the flaps up and all that stuff and head out. So that was kind of exciting and fun. It was very, first time out, you know, always when you're going into a combat area, you're worried about it because you don't know. One great thing about life is the familiarity. You got to be careful because you don't want to breed contempt, but familiarity gives you more of a comfort level. So once we kind of figured out what the routine was and what we were expected to do, it became more pretty much routine. And since we weren't supposed to close the beach, we were told if you come back with a hole in one of those planes, this is what the CAG told us. He said, don't stop at the Intrepid. Just keep on going east, because, you know, we're not going to tolerate that. Because the ADs were getting shot down over there. The year before I was there, they were running the straight A's. We call the single seaters the straight A's. They were running the straight A's in the North Vietnam. In fact, some of you know, in one of our members of our group shot down a jet, a MiG, with the straight A. But we're very vulnerable because we cruised at 180 indicated airspeed, between 180 and 260, depending on what we were doing. We could do, I've done 330 downhill in one, but we carried a radome under it, and we carried jammers, and you know, you just don't, it's not a rocket ship, you know, type of thing. So they were very concerned that we were vulnerable to missiles, and we were vulnerable to the MiGs for sure, and to anti-aircraft fire. So since we were considered to be a major asset to the fleet, they wouldn't let us go over the land. Yeah. And we later learned, we used to think, you know, what are we doing? You know, they called us zappers and all. And you know, when you shoot a gun, you see a bullet and a flash, and you kind of get feedback. But when all you're doing is shooting electronic energy out there, you're kind of wondering, you know, what am I doing? Is it doing any good? That type of thing. But the pilots got where on those A4s, they wouldn't fly. They didn't like to fly, let me put it that way. If one of our planes was down and couldn't go, they did not like to fly, because they felt that we were really effective because we did force them to go to barrage, which means they'd shoot at an altitude, you know, they'd shoot 10,000 feet or something like that and explode like you see in the World War II movies, or they'd have to do visual acquisition. So they told us, if you guys don't go, we don't want to go. And so apparently they felt we were doing some things.
Were they allowed not to go if you didn't go?
No. They just would say to us, you know, we're concerned about that. Now, we did get shot at, though.
Talk about that.
Yeah. In between strikes, of course, we're out there tooling around going, you know, we're kind of boring holes, and, you know, we're young and crazy. And now that I look at it, I always thought 35 was old, you know. Yeah. So my ONC was like 35. He was a lieutenant commander. He was really an old guy, you know, this type of thing. And I'm 23 or 24, you know, we thought he was the old man type of stuff. And even the captains now seem real young, the skippers of the ships. But, you know, being young and stupid, you know, we couldn't take no, you know, I mean, we couldn't follow instructions very well. And so we would go sightseeing. And I will say this about Vietnam. My first impression of Vietnam is I thought, this is really a beautiful country. Why are we at war? And from the air and looking at the beaches up north, my feeling was, if they would just let Hilton come over here and build a resort, or something like, one of the other developers. I said, this would be an incredible vacation spot. It was gorgeous. I mean, they have white sand beaches and they have cliffs that go up, and it was just it looked amazing to me, and I just thought, wow, too bad that we have to be fighting and doing this. But we would go sightseeing. And one day we were sightseeing, and there was a point that sticks out, and I couldn't find my chart, but it kind of sticks out if you look at Haiphong and Hanoi are up here, and it curves around, and this thing goes out like this, and then it curves back around and goes down to South Vietnam. And it was Point Mui Ron Ma, and we used it for navigation purposes because it was quite a protuberance out into the Tonkin Gulf. And so we were tooling down one day, and it had high cliffs, I'm trying to remember, and they were beautiful and covered with green. And we were just tooling down, and I had a camera, had an 8mm that I was filming. And I was just filming down, the cliffside and everything. All of a sudden, the dadgum cliffside opened up. And they were shooting tracers at us. And I imagine they were probably 20mm tracers, and we had 20mm cannons on the plane. And they were coming all of a sudden across the cockpit, and you know how they would range. Well, my pilot says, "Did you get that? Did you get that?" I'm sitting there, you're shooting at me, and he's worried about me getting it on film, So about this time, the film runs out. The camera runs out. And he's going to max military rated power, and he's starting to take evasive action, and he's beating me with his arm over there and said, "Get it on film." Well, I was so excited about this. I mean, they're shooting at me, and I got him over here, and the planes, we're going to max power, and everything's going on. And I ripped the film out. I mean, this is not like a VCR or DVD that we have nowadays. And I'm worrying with it, and I ripped the film out and exposed the film, and I couldn't get it back in. And I said, well, we're not going to go back there again and take a rerun on this thing, because it's me that they were shooting at. I mean, he's over here on this side. I'm seeing the tracers come right over, my head. And we got out of there, but I remember that, and he was very mad at me that I did not get all this on film. Well, I had it on film, but it was just exposed. Yeah. You know how that works. Yeah. So that was a real exciting experience. And then another day, as if we didn't learn, we decided to stay away from there because we found that they had caves on there, and they had weapons in those caves, and I imagine they were waiting for the ships or something, somebody to close in. And they probably did it also, now that I'm thinking about it, because they would run little boats up and down that coast there, which we were not allowed to touch, that would be carrying weapons. But for some reason, since this was a political war, that we had limitations on what we could do. Yeah. So we'd go down, and one day we went down and did the beaches south of Point Mui Ran Ma. And we were tooling along at about 50 feet, and we were right off the beach. And we were looking at these little hooches and villages, and the fishermen were out and all this kind of stuff. And it was really neat and pretty and sightseeing. And we had a rear view mirror on there, and I'm looking in my mirror because you learn in aviation, always watch your six. So I'm scanning around and I'm looking, and all of a sudden I see geysers behind us. And I mean geysers. They were going up higher than we were in altitude. I mean, we were flat down about 50 feet off the deck. And I said, they're shooting at us. And what they were doing is they had walked them up the beach behind us. And I just, fortunately, was looking around and saw these things and saw the geysers coming out of the water. And so that's what they would do, is they would range you, and they would first get in line with you, and then they would start walking up on you. And they were walking up on us, and fortunately I saw it in time, and we broke again and went to military rated power and climbed out of there real fast and just got the heck out of Dodge. But that was another day that it was kind of you know, exciting for guys that weren't supposed to get shot at, you know. Now, I know you guys on the ground and all that stuff. I mean, my hat's off to you, but this was exciting enough. I would not want to be shot at on a daily basis, and fortunately was not.
You mentioned something that I want to ask you about, if you can discuss it at all, that there were reports that the North Vietnamese were bringing weapons down by sea, but that you weren't allowed to take any action against those vessels. Did you have experiences where you were pretty sure you saw a vessel that was bringing weapons and you couldn't do anything?
Well, I mean, we would go down and look, and what do you know? I mean, they were these fishing type powered vessels, and yeah, they were carrying something. I mean, I can't say I ever saw a weapon, but I will tell you that when the bombing halt occurred in the fall of 1968, Lyndon Johnson declared a bombing halt. That's another story. All of a sudden, that traffic increased tremendously. So we knew they were bringing weapons, and we were told you can't mess with them. I mean, this was one of the frustrating things about fighting in Vietnam. You can't mess with them, just monitor them. And they had a campaign or something called Operation Market Time. I think that was the name of it. And it was to conduct surveillance. And they were using these modified S-2s, which were anti-submarine war aircraft. They weren't off of our carrier, somebody else's. And they were out there supposedly monitoring this traffic. But it's clear because it was just like a highway. It would be just like taking a road and sitting there during the middle of the day with very little traffic on it, then at rush hour all of a sudden. I mean, those boats were going down. They weren't fishing.
Yeah.
They were going down there, but we were forbidden to do anything with them. So,
Yeah.
you know, having said that, and one of the things that we said along this line, and this bears on the politics of Vietnam, is one day I was sitting there for the briefing, and we had some exchange Air Force officers with us. We had about 3 or 4 that were Air Force officers, and they would fly with the A4 squadrons. And I remember a guy sitting there, and we were BSing, and we were being briefed on the strike we were getting ready to go on. And he didn't come back, and we lost him. And I've never heard what happened to him, but we lost him. And that was pretty unsettling. And then I had a friend that was in what we called a STOOF, it was a Willie Fudd squadron, and Willie Fudd it was WF 120, that was, I can't remember the designation of the plane, but it was we call it a STOOF with a roof. It was an S-2 that carried the early warning radar, and we had a couple of those aboard. And he was practicing to become a landing signal officer, LSO officer, you know, back on the back there. And we had an A4 that had gone out on a maintenance hop to be checked out that came back. And just as he came across the round down, he rolled and went inverted. And he wiped out the LSO platform, and he went across the gun tub back on the port side and decapitated himself, and it went into the water. Now, we were sitting in the ready room, and in the ready room we had a television screen. We monitored all these recoveries because we'd watch our own planes and people would critique them and stuff like that. And we saw this all occur on that. And this young man and I had been on the beach together. He was a personal friend. We hit the beach. He just had a baby boy. And his wife, and he was all excited. We were excited for him because we were friends. We were in the prop squadron. The props were all friends. And I remember I went back to my stateroom and I cried. And I just thought, I said, why are they killing us needlessly? And this is a comment on the Vietnam War. We all said out there, we're not baby killers, we're not killers, we're just doing our duty and doing what our country asks of us. But why kill us for needlessly? And when I had this experience of losing these 2 people, I thought this is just cannon fodder, and we can win. and everybody out there, the general attitude was either let us win or let us go home. But don't just kill us for a political reason. And that's what we felt like. And I felt that very powerfully, and I apologize if I'm getting a little teary-eyed, because I can remember crying in the stateroom. And I'm a naval officer, and here I am an aviator and all this stuff. But that was a very powerful experience for me. And it really got next to me. Now, did it affect me as far as, serving my country? No. But we all felt that, and that brought it home to me. And I can imagine how guys on the ground felt when they lost their buddies and stuff. Because we all know ultimately it's about who our comrades are, who our fellows in arms are, and that's what it's about. And they're the people that we serve and protect. And the larger country is, yes, we do it, but ultimately when we're out there in these situations, we're doing it for our shipmates and our squadron mates and stuff like that. So that's a commentary, and I wanted to share that because I think people need to know that we were willing to do our duty for our country. But we did not like the idea that we were being used for political purposes. And I'm sophisticated enough to know that all wars are political. There's no question. We've been fighting one recently. And for example, when we went into Iraq, people say, how do you feel about it? I said, well, if we're going in to win, and it's not going to be run by politicians for political purposes, and we're not going to kill young men and women simply for political purposes, then I guess it's okay. But otherwise, I'm not for it, because we do not need another Vietnam. And so that was something that, we experienced. So I've kind of told you a whole lot, and there's a little bit more that's kind of...
Well, thank you for sharing that. It's important to hear
Yeah.
a veteran's feeling about issues like that.
Yeah, sure. Well, I did mention, we would go into QB Point in between, and we would go to places like we went to Singapore. We, of course, went back to the Philippines to QB Point, Subic Bay. We went into Japan. We went into, where else? We went into Hong Kong. So we did some exotic R&Rs, and that we would spend like a week or 2 weeks in one of these places, and so that was really neat, a lot of fun. And then in October, and this is kind of a funny story. I think it was in October. We were in between strikes, and I was listening to the the Armed Forces Radio Network, because they play music and stuff like that. And we were in between strikes, and it was kind of boring. And we were out boring holes, and I heard Lyndon Johnson. They came on and said, there's a message from the President of the United States. Now, those days, we didn't have immediate communications like we have now. But I think the radio was fairly contemporaneous. They could broadcast that and pick it up and broadcast it around the world. So Lyndon Johnson came on, and he's a my fellow Americans, and started out that way. And he said, at such and such a time, I'm going to declare a bombing halt in the North. And when the minute he said that, I'm the only one listening now, okay? We're thinking the war is over. They're pulling us out of here. We're going to go home. It's real exciting. So there are two buttons down on the floor. One is for external communications, and the other is for internal communications. Well, I got so excited, I hit guard, hit the wrong button. And I start hollering to the guys in the back, I thinking to my pilot, the war's over, the war's over. Well, apparently this went out over Channel 16, went out through the entire fleet, went out through all the aircraft. Everybody in the Gulf of Tonkin, everybody, they hear this crazy fool screaming, the war's over, the war's over. Then I realized my mistake. And so then we get back to the carrier, and we're down in the ready room and all, and they said, y'all hear that broadcast? Because, see, they hadn't gotten it on the ship, hadn't been announced. And did y'all hear somebody yelling the war was over? What was all that about? Somebody was yelling on guard that the war was over. I'm sitting there going, no, it wasn't I, I'm not going to confess to this, I confessed 40 years later, 50 years later, but Anyway, that was kind of funny, you know, and of course then later they came across the one MC on the ship, which is the broadcast system, and said, the president, this is a recording of the message of the president, which is what I have, you know, heard. But I'm telling you right now, the war was not over.
Well, what was the reaction of your shipmates
Well,
to
we
the
didn't
bombing
Yeah,
halt?
we were confused. We didn't know. We thought, well, what are we gonna do now? Okay, and they told us quickly, the war's not over, and that we've been ordered to go down to Dixie Station, which was south of the DMZ. The Yankee Station's in the Gulf of Tonkin north, Dixie Station's down more into the South China Sea and that area. So, said, gonna go down there and we figure out what you're gonna do. And I'm going to share a story that I've shared with some people, and you guys might appreciate this. And this is one of those things where I think that we all, as people and naval officers and Army officers, Air Force, anybody, have to stand up and be counted. They were casting about for what are we going to do, and there was talk about sending us down to go do close ground support in South Vietnam, because if any of you are familiar, the Air Force equivalent of our plane was called a Sandy. It was an A1E, and it just didn't have all the electronic stuff and all. And they were doing what we call RESCAP, Rescue Combat Air Patrol rescue missions. And they were doing close ground support, and if you've seen the movie, We Were Young Once, which some of y'all were in that battle, they have a picture, and a Sandy comes over and strafes, and everybody's all excited because the AD could fly. We called it low and slow. And they were talking about sending us down there to do close ground support. And we were having a meeting, and I was the air crew officer, meaning I was responsible for all the enlisted guys. And most of them that were with us were air crew, and then they did other things. And I had talked to some of them and gone back and talked to them and said, you know, what is y'all feeling about this? Because I had told our ONC and the other officer that was the assistant, I said, you know, we weren't trained for this mission, and our men weren't trained for this mission, and you guys really aren't trained for this mission. And I don't have a problem, but it needs to be, in my opinion, voluntary. In other words, if the pilot wants to volunteer to go shoot them up, because these guys were itching to shoot the guns, they love to shoot the guns, you know, and it was fun to shoot the guns. But you know, it's different when you're shooting at people and getting shot at. And I said, it's not right to ask the air crew, being the naval, the flight officers, and most officers, the flight officers, we would go. There was not any question that we all would do it because we were an adjunct to the plane. But I said, it's not right to ask the enlisted people unless they just want to go for the ride, you know, type of thing. And the enlisted air crew came to me and said that they appreciate it because they did not want to do that. It was not their job, it's not their mission. They didn't want to go get put in harm's way needlessly, because there's a lot of danger, because people are going to shoot at you, plus that you're going to be doing rolling in, and you're going to be doing a lot of stuff that you're not really trained for. Although we did gun runs and things like that. We shot at stuff to practice and all, but just not trained for it. Well, when my fitness report came out, I was written up as being disloyal, which has always been a tremendous offense to me, because I'm probably one of the most loyal people in the world. My father fought in Korea in World War II. I was brought up to serve my country. I was out there serving my country, and I thought, you know, this is really narrow and shows a lack of integrity that somebody would question my loyalty because I brought that to their attention and questioned that the necessity of putting other lives at risk. We ultimately didn't go. I think because I kicked. I think that we ultimately didn't do it, which we had no business doing.
Yeah.
So then they told us that we could fly up north and do this market time. You know, we could kind of monitor and keep an eye on things. So that got scary, because now we're not in an American lake, so to speak. It's a little scarier. We've moved the ships down south. And so we were low and slow, and we were told that, you know, anytime there's a MiG that takes off at Hanoi, to get out of there, because we don't know what they're doing. And so we monitored 16 carefully, and we would be patrolling the coast, and we would hear the call was bandits bullseye, and that meant a MiG was taking off from North Vietnam, Hanoi somewhere. The Hanoi's where the big air base was. And we would turn around and skedaddle out of there, and then they would scramble F-4s and F-8s to come running up, you know, to go take them on and all. So we always worried that in between coming back and these guys going up, you know, that somebody might catch up with us. And we were always talking about what we would do and whether we would get on the ground, get down to the water level. And it would be hard to see us, you know, down on the water. It's real hard. The planes were gray, and that's one of the reasons. So that was a little tense on occasion, and we were flying those missions. We did that for about 2 months, I think, and then came off the cycle and ultimately came back home in the spring of, and finished our round the world, went back to Rio de Janeiro, went to New Zealand, went to Australia. It was great. Went around the Horn, and the Horn is everything they tell you it is. We are on a 1,000-foot ship that is, what, 40 feet, high. The deck is 40 feet or better off the water, and we were taking white water over the bow of the aircraft carrier coming back around, and it was pretty. It was pretty neat. I mean, it was pretty exciting. And of course, no flight ops or anything else like that. And then went into Rio de Janeiro, then we got home. Now, this is the other thing that is so different than today for all of us. And this is why we say, welcome home, brother. Because nobody welcomed us home. And the only people that cared about us, as we know, were our families and our fellow squadron or people, ship people, you know, the Navy folks, the Army folks, the Air Force folks. So we go into Norfolk, and of course they've got the band in the ship, and we're all lined up on the ship, and the families are down there on the dock. Our families weren't, because our families were in Quonset Point, Rhode Island. So it was kind of anticlimactic to come in. It was a really emotional experience, very emotional. But they didn't have the news cameras that I know of. They didn't have all this attention. It was just our Navy family out there. Yeah. But, you know, to come back after being deployed for 9, 10, 11 months and then have your family out there, the people like that at least, it was very powerful, and it was very kind of teary, made you teary-eyed and everything, because we then had to offload everything off the ship and had to fly the planes up. And again, I was assigned to take care of the air crew and escort everybody and, you know, take an airplane, transport and get everybody up there. That was my job at the time. I was a senior lieutenant JG by that time. But I remember how powerful that was to be coming home and coming into Norfolk and seeing all those people. And it was a really emotional experience to see that. And then we get into Quonset Point at 2 o'clock in the morning, you know, fly in. And of course, all we have is just our little family out there. Not all this stuff that you see on television nowadays and acknowledging the troops. I mean, it was like isolation. And then we were told we couldn't wear our uniforms home, or we had to go straight home from the base. We couldn't stop anywhere in our uniforms because there were people out, you know, that were angry at the war, and we were the targets. Now, I'd been gone almost a year fighting for my country. And then I come back, and I'm very proud of my uniform. And I mean, I've lived in a uniform most of my life. I was a midshipman for 4 years. And to be told I could not wear the uniform of my service in my country because there are people that were angry with us and that were attacking us. And I'm sitting over there thinking of, here I am crying and breaking down, and I don't want to be here to hurt anybody or do anything. I just want to do my job, but I don't want to get killed for nothing. And I'm willing and commit myself, and then come home and tell me I can't wear my uniform. I mean, you know how devastating that was. We've all been there. That was hard. And so I found out, I got out of the Navy. I went on and became, talk about other duty stations. I was given a chance to go to our new squadron, which was a composite squadron. I was the personnel officer, and when we came back, they decided to close up our squadron because the planes, they were antiques. I mean, they'd been flying 25, 30 years at the time, and the Prowler was coming online. And so they were closing up the squadron, and I was the personnel officer and helped do that. And I put an aside to this, going back to when Johnson declared the bombing halt. Actually, I have seen in a book somewhere about the Sky Raider in Vietnam that I actually probably flew the last single-engine combat prop mission in the United States Navy. When I say I, it was, but, a couple of us, that were in the air. I was in the air when the bombing halt was called, and we were in between strikes. And so we may have flown one or two more rotations. And I'm sure I flew those because that's what I was doing. So with my squadron mates, we flew the very last single-engine combat prop planes of the United States Navy. Because when we came back, they closed up the squadron, stood it down, and they gave the planes to the South Vietnamese. They told us and sent them around to museums. And one of my planes is down at the museum in Pensacola, physically that I flew in, is down there on the back lot. But I went on, and after we stood the squadron down, I was sent to Glencoe, back to Naval Air Technical Training Center, Naval Air Station Glencoe in Brunswick, Georgia, to become the a training officer for the Advanced Naval Flight Officer. And I had a collateral billet of being the legal officer for Naval Air Technical Training Center because we lost our JAG. And then I also created a program called Operation Shipover because we were losing so many highly qualified and trained enlisted personnel that the Navy was hemorrhaging trained people at the time because the Vietnam War made it difficult. People that had done their service said, I want out of this. I don't want to go spend another year over there and all this kind of stuff. And so my wife at that time and she was in public relations, created this thing called Operation Shipover, which the VUPERS people and all, I was invited to Washington to present it and all. And we actually did it within the training command and all, and for a while to try to encourage people. And we developed a program to do it. And I remember the poster, and remember the old Uncle Sam poster with Uncle Sam wants you. We had a Navy captain in his whites saying, I want you to ship over. Yeah. And so that was something I did. Good. And then I left down there and came to Atlanta to go to law school at Emory, and graduated in '73. I was in the reserves for another 5 years, I think. I went into naval intelligence in the reserves because I didn't want to fly on the weekends, and I'd have to go to Jacksonville, Navy Jacks, to fly. And so that created problems because how am I going to get down there? How am I going to get back over the weekend? It's just very disruptive. And so I went into naval, changed my designator to naval intelligence, and was in that group until I just couldn't practice law doing that. I was a trial lawyer, and trials start on Mondays or Tuesdays, and I'd have weekends. And then we had, back in those days, we had all this stuff going on in Egypt, just same thing we got today. The Egyptians and the Israelis were fighting, and we were part of the fleet. We were the original reserve units that were actually part of the fleet. So we could get called in, and we got called in on off weekends. It wasn't just always the second weekend of the month or something. And so that got very difficult for me. And although I wanted to stay in and love the Navy, I just couldn't do it. It was a very hard thing for me to do. I'd grown up in the Navy with my father. I'd been, gotten a scholarship and worn the uniform. Then I'd spent almost 5 years on active duty, gotten wings, done all this kind of stuff, and to give up the Navy, it was just really hard for me. Yeah. But I did, and then practiced law 23 years, and then I was elected judge in 1996. I'm a Superior Court judge in Fulton County, Atlanta, Georgia, and elected in 1996, and served since then. So I'm going up close on my 16th year as the Superior Court judge, highest court of general trial jurisdiction in Georgia. I try murder and mayhem. and everything in between. That kind of gives you a synopsis of what's gone on. But I would like to comment for future generations about this again. A lot of us suppressed our experiences. I didn't really think about it consciously. And, you know, I know there were some guys when we went back to law school, there were a handful of us that were veterans. In fact, one guy was in my squadron, not at the same time I was, but he was in there before I was, Bob Winholtz. And so we did talk among ourselves of our experiences, and, you know, I guess we BS here and there about them, but I really didn't think that much about it. But when I was in the reserves, I had to wear a wig because in my civilian role, my hair was longer at the time, especially in law school. In fact, the very first thing, and I'm sorry to jump around, very first thing I remember at law school is the flagpole on the quadrangle in Emory was out in front of the law school, and here I think I was in law school 2 or 3 days, and they had a demonstration out there and tore the flag down. You don't think that it affected some of us? Well, it affected me because of how I feel about all of this. But along came the Desert Storm, and they did a parade, which some of you guys may remember, Channel 4 did, where they welcomed back on July the 4th, Channel 2, on July the 4th, they welcomed back the veterans from Desert Storm. And we, as our group, Atlanta Vietnam Veterans Business Association, marched in it. And I remember the people standing up off the street. They got up off the curb, you know, they stood up for us. They came out and started clapping for us. And all of a sudden, it hit me. It just hit me like a ton of bricks. I started crying. I mean, I just couldn't help it. And I thought, in retrospect, you know, it's taken 20 some odd years at that time to get closure. I never realized until that moment that I'd never had closure because we weren't welcomed home. We were ostracized. And so we just kind of put that away in the back of our lives, you know, all of us sitting here. We put it away and tucked it away. Yeah, we talked about it with our wives, we talked about it with our friends, you know, BS'd a little bit about it, but we really never stood up and were proud of it and, you know, came out. We were proud inside, but couldn't share it. And I never realized how powerful that suppression was until that day when those people stood up when we came. And I said, well, we're being welcomed home. We never got a parade. We didn't get any of this stuff that these young folks these days are getting, which I am absolutely 100%, so I'm not being jealous or selfish about it. I'm just saying this is what the deal was. And now they do recognize this, and this is what we're doing now as part of that project. But that was a very powerful moment for me. And the reason I share that, because I really hadn't realized I'd suppressed it. I just really hadn't realized that I had kind of suppressed all those feelings and everything, and until that moment. And I guess we all had some sort of what they call post-traumatic stress, you know, disorder and all. I ended up losing a marriage. You know, my marriage ultimately went away, and I think there were some issues in there that related to my, you know, being away for a year at the beginning of our marriage. I mean, you know, there were other reasons and all, but I think Vietnam affected all of us in many ways that we all don't realize. Any war affects people. And when you don't have the support of those that are your society and people that you work with and everything else, then it's, you know, it's hard. And there were some guys that in my law firm that I went to that had, you know, one guy had been in the Army or somebody hadn't been a Vietnam veteran. And then others, they look at you kind of askance, you know, oh, you were in Vietnam, you know, this kind of stuff. And, you know, I said, yeah, okay, you know, and move on. But it was, it's been pretty powerful to have society treat you in that way. And I just didn't realize until then how negative it was. Now, it's a positive for me. People have come back around. I wear my wings, and you see my wings and my ribbon up here with pride. Of course, in being a politician nowadays, it helps, you know, you kiss babies and you were a veteran, you know, that kind of stuff, you know. Which I do, and you know, I do all of that as a politician. Unfortunately, as a judge, I have to run. I've run 4 campaigns, so you know, I know how that works, but it helps. And you know, nowadays people come up and thank you, and you know, it's really nice. So it's different than my dad's generation and all. But of course, he experienced some of that with Korea. We know the Korean veterans experienced that too. So that's basically my story. You know.
Okay, that last part is so important, and I want to thank you for sharing that, because that's going to be on a record that's going to last a long time, and a lot of people are going to see you and hear what you said, and it's probably going to have an influence on people. So,
well, we all know that it's not the men and women that are fighting the war that make the policy and the decisions. They're executing what their country calls on them to do. And that's what we missed and got wrong in Vietnam. And I think they've kind of figured that out now. Don't hold it against the soldiers and the sailors that are out serving their country and doing their job. You know. So
that's a
I don't
great
know
message.
what else to, you know, what else to share with you guys. I think I've pretty much covered some of the things that I wanted to speak about.
Do you want to hold up that picture of you at the crossing the equator?
Oh yeah, I did bring some other things along. First of all, I'd like to have copies put in with this. I did bring along, these are some ship's messages, and they just happen to be some that I sent to my mother and father, and the ship would prepare them. Nowadays they do it on DVD or something, and they were already pre-printed, and we could send them back to our family. And this has to Commander and Mrs. T.J. Bedford, and they lived in Tucker, Georgia at the time. That's one of the reasons how I got up to Emory, is I came up to visit. But they're very informative, and they have information from the commanding officer, and he was sending a message to the families, and this is how we communicated to the families. So, you know, just so that you guys can see this and make copies and put the copies with it. I have, as I said, 2 of them here, and this is pretty neat stuff that's in there, because it's telling the families what our experience has been, and that we spent Christmas online, all that kind of thing. It's pretty neat. And then the other one you had asked about is, I have a picture of me. Can you see that?
Yes, let's go.
Okay. This is skinny, young 24-year-old me, or whatever age I was. And in the Navy, those of all that do not know, we have a ceremony when you cross the equator. And you have to, pretty much you're a polywog until you're initiated. And you have to do all kinds of grotesque things. And one of the things you have to do is kiss the belly button of King Neptune. And they usually have the biggest, fattest, ugliest chief aboard ship, and they grease his stomach up, and he sits up there like Jabba the Hutt, and you know, his belly's hanging out, and he's sitting on a throne, and you have to go up and kiss his belly button, and after you've been tortured in the process and paddled and everything else. So that's the ceremony. And then you become initiated. You're a hardback, or a shellback, I guess is what they call it, shellback, and instead of a polywog. And so this was the second crossing, when we were crossing going back from Vietnam, and we had polywogs aboard. And so that is my squadron hat, VAQ 33 on there, and I'm out in my running shorts. And one great thing about a carrier is you can work out on it, and you can run. You can run laps in the hangar bay, and you can run laps on the deck. And if you're going into the wind, you're pushing against the wind, you're going away from the wind, you're running downhill. So stayed in pretty good shape when I was out there, because we could work out and had weights and could run and all of that. But that's what those pictures are about. Yeah, part of the life experience that, you know, going through this stuff that we all know. Every service has that. Anything else that I can share?
Well, we just want to give you a chance. If you have anything else you would like to share before we close, either for people that are gonna
Yeah.
see this in the immediate future or down the road, feel free to say anything else you'd like to say.
I had made some notes on here, but I think I've covered almost everything. Yeah, that's pretty much covered it, and
Okay.
I will like to say this to everybody, that I was very proud to be a naval officer, and I was very proud to serve my country, and have no regrets.
Ed, do you or Tony have any questions?
No, I'd like to talk to him later,
Okay.
because me and him were in the same spots,
Okay.
a lot of the same spots.
Well, I want to thank you on behalf of all of us in this room and also the Veterans History Project for sharing your story. I mean, you've got not only an interesting story, but a very courageous story and some wonderful messages. And you obviously saved a lot of lives, because those pilots didn't want to go up if you weren't up. So you should take a lot of satisfaction in the fact that there are probably a lot of pilots around now that wouldn't have been around without you up in the air. And
We hope.
Well, I think that's, I'm assuming that is true, and
Yeah.
you're a true patriot, and we really appreciate your service to the country and the life you've lived since you served in Vietnam.
Well, just as a final note, if we're still on, one of the things I talk about when I'm talking to young lawyers, and I was out at Emory speaking last week, and I do this quite frequently, is I talk about the importance of service. And, you know, I realized at one stage in my life here about 20 years ago, and looking back at my life, it had been one of service. And it started with my service to my country in the military. And I'm really saddened that we don't have that opportunity for everybody nowadays. And I think all the guys sitting around here, we all agree. Even if you were conscripted, if you were drafted, it's a powerful experience. But I have learned through my life that we really are about service to our community, to our country, to our organizations, to help better our community. And so I would say that I think, in my experience has been through our Vietnam Veterans Business Association and all, if you look around, you will see almost every person in that group, one way or another, still continues to serve. And that foundation was laid back when we were serving our country in Vietnam. And we don't think about it, we just do it.
Yeah.
It's part of us and part of who we are. And that's what our message is from our group now, is that, you know, we're not baby killers and ne'er-do-wells. We're people that, where we have the ability, we're about serving. And even a lot of us that were injured and wounded psychologically and physically, a lot of them have turned those things into positives and gone on to serve. Look at Max Cleland. Max Cleland, I mean, he's a quadruple amputee for all practical purposes. I think, well, triple, he's got one good arm, and he's done tremendous contribution to our state and to our country. So I think that's what all of us should be about, and I think that's what all of us have been about. Okay?
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay?